This is not my story, it's my dad's. He was in Hope, New Jersey, and had come home from college for Christmas. He was sleeping in the basement with his two sisters, who were also visiting for the holiday. The basement of my grandparents' house is not completely underground because the house sits on a steep hill, so the back wall of the basement is all windows and has a single door that goes outside. On his first night there, my dad woke up sometime in the middle of the night feeling really hazy. He said it felt like everything was extremely heavy and trying to push him back to sleep. When he sat up in the cot he was lying in, he saw 3 lights right outside the main basement window. He said there were 3 different colored lights that were in a triangle shape, and the lights were rotating from spot to spot, switching out from one corner of the triangle to the next. He got up and went over to a couch that was in the basement where his little sister was sleeping to try and wake her up, but no matter how hard he shook her, she wouldn't wake up. At that point, he started to panic and got really scared that someone might be trying to break into the house, then felt a strong wave of lightheadedness hit him. He lost his footing and stumbled, running directly into the large main window and shattering it. Part of the glass sliced into his forearm, and he remembers feeling it happen, then looking down and seeing his arm start to bleed, but that was the last thing he remembers. This is where it gets really strange. He woke up the next morning back in his cot and freezing cold. He saw the broken window as soon as he opened his eyes, but had no memory of anything happening at all. When he saw the window and the broken glass on the floor, he immediately ran upstairs and got my grandpa to come down to check it out. They both figured it had either been someone trying to break in or possibly a bird or owl at night that had somehow slammed into the window. Either way, they both thought it was crazy that he or his 2 sisters didn't hear it break or have any memory of what had happened. It's a pretty big window, and it had to be loud when it shattered like that. Also, most of the glass was on the outside, which made it look like it had been broken from the inside, which is why it was even more of a mystery. After that, they cleaned up the glass and put several cut-up cardboard boxes that they had taped together over the open hole. Just 2 days later, they had a window company come out to fix it. This was on Christmas Eve day. My dad still had no memory of anything that happened that night, but as he was helping my grandpa move one of the chairs to make room for the guys bringing in the new window, he noticed a decent-sized scar going about 4 inches down his forearm. He had never seen the scar before that moment, and it instantly brought back the memory of what had happened the night the window broke. He said a flood of memories hit him all at once, and he could remember getting out of the cot to wake up his sister, then seeing the lights outside of the window, and then falling into it. But the next memory terrified him. He remembered grabbing his arm as soon as the glass cut it, then falling down onto the ground and on his side. He said he looked up at the broken window and saw the silhouettes of 2 very tall, thin people walking into the house. He says people, but he also says the size and shape of the silhouettes were far from what a person looks like. I guess they moved very unnaturally, and it scared him horribly. The next thing he remembered was one of the silhouettes coming in the door and toward him. Then he put his arm up to try and block whatever might happen, almost thinking it was someone breaking in that might hit him. Then felt whatever this was grab his arm, and that was it. That was the end of his memories. The rush of memories was overwhelming, and it made him set the chair down, but he didn't know what to say to my grandpa about it. It was such a bizarre memory that he didn't want to say anything and sound crazy. He also didn't want my grandpa to think he was on some kind of drug or drunk and broke the window, so he just collected himself, got back up, and finished helping him move things in the basement and never said a word to my grandpa. After that, he couldn't stop thinking about it while they were all eating lunch upstairs. He was trying to piece the memories together and figure out what had actually happened when something hit him that was almost more bizarre than the memories. His arm had a scar on it, not a fresh cut or an injury that was scabbed over and healing. This was an actual scar, like a scar from something that happened years ago and had fully healed. There was even arm hair that had grown back over the scar. This sent him into a spiral that he never really got over, and it's something he still has a hard time talking about. I've heard the story a few times, and every time I try to dig for more details, at some point he'll just shut down and not want to talk about it anymore. It's very weird to see him act like that. My dad is an extremely level-headed guy. After college, he was in the military for 8 years and still has a really good job with the government. He's insanely organized and logical to the point of it being annoying, so he's just not someone that would ever make up a weird story like this. I don't take most UFO or alien stories seriously, but I can't help it with his story. I not only take it seriously, but I think he had an actual encounter with something. It was the summer of 2005 in White Bear Lake, Minnesota. My boyfriend at the time lived on Otter Lake, and we spent a lot of time out on the water. That evening, we had taken his family's pontoon boat out for a relaxing ride just as the sun was setting. The lake was calm, the sky was deep orange and purple, and I remember it being a perfect summer night. We weren't expecting anything unusual. It was just another peaceful evening on the water. As we floated, I noticed the temperature suddenly shift. A sharp, biting wind came from the opposite side of the lake, the side covered in thick, unbroken forest. It was strange because up until that moment, the air had been still and warm. This wind, though, was cold, unnaturally cold for a summer night, and it made me shiver. I even remember rubbing my arms as we were looking toward the tree line across the lake. That's when we saw these bright blue orbs of light rising up out of the trees. They weren't flares or fireworks because they were just slowly rising up into the air. There are no roads or trails in that part of the woods, and as far as we knew, nothing was back there at all. But these lights seemed to move with a purpose. They lifted up high into the sky in complete silence, barely shifting from the formation they were in. The intensity of the glow was unlike anything I'd seen before, too. It wasn't like a diffused or soft light, it was a sharp, almost crystalline blue, and they were all pulsing slightly as they flew up. There had to be about 15 of them in total, all spread out, maybe 100 feet across, and going straight up in the air. We both somewhat panicked because it was so unexpected. My boyfriend scrambled to turn on the boat, but it wouldn't start. This was really weird because it was a newer pontoon with no mechanical problems, plenty of gas, and it had always started and run perfectly. He kept trying, but it was like the battery was dead and it wasn't doing anything. Right at the same time, I felt my stomach drop because I could feel that the boat was no longer just drifting, it was moving. But it wasn't moving away from the lights like you would think because that's the way the wind was blowing. We were now moving toward them, as if there were a current pulling us over to that side of the lake. I grabbed onto the side of the boat, trying to figure out what was happening, but it made no sense. The wind was pushing against us, but the boat was being pulled toward the lights. My boyfriend was still trying to start the boat, and I was getting really scared. I even considered jumping into the water to swim back to shore, but it was a little farther than I was comfortable swimming. My mind was definitely racing with ideas of how we could get away from whatever this was. Finally, after what felt like an eternity but was probably only a minute or two, I heard the engine of the boat start. My boyfriend threw it into reverse and turned us around, then we sped back to his dock on the other side of the lake. When we got back to the house, we told his mom everything that had happened. She listened the whole time and then said something that made my skin crawl. She told us that his grandmother, who was technically still the owner of the house, had seen something almost identical decades ago, all the way back in the 1950s. I guess she had been out on the water when she was in her 20s and saw strange lights rising from that same part of the woods, but when it happened to her, she saw them come back down onto the surface of the lake and go underwater. His mom had never thought much about it and told us she'd nearly forgotten it even happened, but hearing our story reminded her. The next day, his grandmother confirmed the story herself when she came over for their weekly family dinner. She said she still remembered it clearly, and it was something she had never been able to explain. It doesn't end there, though. The next day was sunny and normal, and we were still a little shaken from the night before, but we went down to his dock, which was just below the house, to do some fishing. At some point, I looked across the lake toward the section of woods where we had seen the lights. I don't know what made me look over there right at that second, but standing there in the trees, partially obscured by branches, was a man. At least I think it was a man. He was wearing a fully enclosed yellow hazmat-style suit, the kind with the full hood and clear face shield like you'd see in some pandemic movie. I told my boyfriend to look over at him, and he immediately tensed up. We both stared, totally silent, as we watched this guy walk around doing God knows what in the forest. We only saw him for maybe 30 seconds, then we both swear he could see us watching him, and the guy slowly stepped backward into the woods until he was completely out of sight. It was super weird because he didn't turn around and walk into the trees. He literally moved straight back, totally facing our side of the lake the whole time. We sat there on the dock, not really knowing what to say. There was no reason for someone to be back there in a full suit like that. We both knew the lake really well, and there were no trails or houses or really anything on that part of the lake. It was nothing but woods, and it was just a weird thing to see. My boyfriend talked about taking the boat over there at some point to investigate and see if we could find anything, but we never did. I don't think I would have gone with him even if he did, but I do wonder what we would have found if we'd gone over there. I have no idea what to think about all of it, but whatever we witnessed over those 2 days was the single most unsettling experience of my life. The two of us split up years ago, but always stayed friends, and whenever we cross paths, we still bring this up. I think I've only been back to Otter Lake a few times since then too, which is kind of sad. I just have a bad feeling about the whole place now, and it kind of ruined it for me. I still live in the area, so maybe someday I'll find out what it was, but until then, I just don't really like to be out there. This was years ago now, back in 2010, but I was driving around with my best friend on some of the back roads just outside of our town in rural Illinois. She and I had been driving these roads since we were 16, and we know them like the back of our hand. We weren't far off of Route 40, just north of a place I used to work, and it was right at dusk. I looked out the side window and about a mile up the road, and I saw something hovering above this farmhouse. When I first saw it, I thought it might be lights that someone had put on a windmill behind their house, but the closer we got, the more I realized this was too big to be part of a windmill. We kept driving down the road and getting closer to it, and I remember being more and more confused about it, then saying out loud, "What is that?" I looked over at my friend and she was staring just as intensely as I was. I think we were both just kind of waiting to get close enough to see it clearly and say, "Oh yeah, that's what it was," but that didn't happen. Finally, we reached the driveway to the property where this thing was, and I swear it felt like slow motion as we drove past it. Right there, above a large field that was behind the house, we could clearly see a silver object suspended between the field and the house. To me, it looked exactly like a chrome cigar with a single row of white lights going across the side facing us. I couldn't give you an exact size because of how high up it was, but it seemed to be at least as long as the house was wide, maybe 40 feet or so. After a second, I asked my friend, "Is that what I think it is?" She was now totally fixated on it and only managed to say, "No one is going to believe us." As soon as she said that, I knew for sure we were both thinking the same thing. I slowed the car down to a crawl, and we sat there watching it as it slowly drifted over the house. Just as it passed the house, it seemed to slightly turn direction. Then it let out this single, amazingly bright flash of light. It was exactly like a camera flash, but on a gigantic scale. I remember it being so bright that because I was looking directly at it, I could close my eyes and see sort of a negative of the landscape burned into my vision for several minutes. It started moving away from us, so we kept going down the road and followed it for maybe a quarter mile, but we lost sight of it after it went perpendicular to the road and farther away from us over private property. After that day, my friend and I both had a newfound interest in sightings and strange things. We would even go on UFO hunts, which was basically just us driving around at night together, laughing and listening to new music, but we loved it. It really was a bonding experience, and we loved that we got to see whatever it was together. There's one more very weird part of my story I want to mention. About a month later, when summer was over and I was a senior in high school, I started to complain about a small cyst or pimple type thing on my back that I could barely reach and was beginning to bother me. It felt really deep, and after a couple of weeks of bringing it up, my mom took me to the doctor. The doctor checked it out and said he felt like it was a foreign body in my back and suggested I see a dermatologist. Shortly after that appointment, I did go to a dermatologist, and within minutes of getting there, they numbed me up and cut into it. It was about 3 inches to the left of my spine, right in the middle of my back. I remember the doctor saying, "What is that?" to an assistant he had helping him, which is not something you want to hear your doctor saying when you're getting something checked out. Then he pulled something out with long tweezers and showed it to me. It was a dark gray, somewhat shiny little sphere with tiny indentations around the entire thing, almost like a tiny metal golf ball. He told my mom and I that his best guess was that I must have been shot with a BB or pellet gun at some point in my life, and it had been under the skin for a while but had gotten mildly infected and was working its way out of my body. I was a bit stunned by that because it didn't make any sense to me, and it was the last thing in the world I thought was causing the bump. I know for an absolute fact that I had never and still have never been shot by any kind of gun, BB, pellet, or otherwise. I don't even have an older brother that could have accidentally shot me when we were young, which even if he did, there's no way I wouldn't remember it. That's not really something I would forget or not notice, especially since it had literally gone into my skin and stayed there. After seeing what was in my back, I was thoroughly grossed out, but happy to have it out and stitched up. It wasn't until I was back in the car with my mom and we were on the way home that I had a bit of an epiphany. I was trying to come up with an explanation for how the weird BB got into my back when it suddenly hit me. I had started noticing that bump just days after seeing that weird thing in the sky with my friend. As soon as I put those two together, I started to feel really uneasy about the whole thing. I wondered if that crazy bright flash of light was more than just a flash. What if more had happened to us than we knew or remembered? I really worked myself into a panic thinking about it. Even now, I don't like to dwell on the sighting we had or what the doctor pulled out of me. Honestly, I wish I'd kept whatever that little dark gray BB was, but it hadn't even crossed my mind to ask the doctor if I could keep it. It seems like a weird question to ask anyway, so I probably wouldn't have asked even if I did want it at the time. I'm sure my mom would have given me a horrible look if I'd asked too. Maybe I'm putting two things together that have nothing to do with each other, but I really feel like they're connected. It's all just too weird to me. If it was connected to our sighting, I'm sure glad that thing is long gone from my body, whatever it was.